Welcome to this edition of Diverse Long Island. I'm Alicia Laventure. The push for immigration reform has stalled under the Obama administration, but the fight continues as the next race for the White House heats up. Pro-reform rallies like this one have been held on the island and across the nation before every national election in recent memory. But lawmakers seem to keep kicking the can down the road. So, is reform possible in an era of partisan politics? Joining me now, Luis Valenzuela, Executive Director of the Long Island Immigrant Alliance, and David Discard-Calic, a senior fellow at the Fiscal Policy Institute. David is also the author of a recent study on the economic contributions of immigrants here on Long Island. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. So now, there was a lot of hope that comprehensive immigration reform would take place under the Obama administration, but it seems more that change won't really happen until after the 2016 race. So with that said, Luis, what's the mood among immigrant rights activists?
Well, the mood is quite hopeful. Clearly, immigration reform is a moral imperative. The American people have stated poll after poll that they're in favor of immigration reform. The time to act is now. Clearly, we cannot continue on the path that we've been on since 1986. It is a question of morality. When we have politicians who demonize immigrants, it pushes them further into the shadows and exposes them to greater and greater exploitation. The time has come for immigration reform.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because as the race for the White House heats up, more and more candidates are saying that they're going to take up this issue. Hillary Clinton has said that she plans to go beyond President Obama's executive actions to protect immigrants from deportation, and Jeb Bush says he's hopeful that meaningful reform will pass. So do you think Democrats and Republicans will ever see eye to eye on this issue? David, we'll start with you.
Well, I think we saw a time when Democrats and Republicans had compromised together to pass the Senate bill, and I think that was, I think that what we've seen since then is a kind of unwillingness of the Republican Party to take on its base in thinking about how to actually see through the promises of that reform. So I think, what you see is people talk about polarization, and I think that's right in the sense that you have it seems to be impossible for the two parties to work together to work out a compromise. I think it's not true in the sense that people sometimes think that it's the two parties moving further apart or the two sides kind of retreating. I think what you see now is Hillary Clinton's position is essentially the McCain-Kennedy bipartisan bill from the last round, and what you see is the Republicans moving further and further, or even the ones who are like Marco Rubio, seeming to be supportive of immigration, needing to walk that back in the face of having to confront primary voters in the Republican Party.
Luis, what about you?
I agree. But clearly, there's a small number who are extremists in their position, and unfortunately, there is this idea, this group thing, that we have to toe the party line. So if the party is saying immigration reform is not going to pass now, they're all voting in lockstep. That's a disservice not only to the aspiring Americans, but it's a disservice to the whole population of the United States. Without immigrants here in the United States, our population would be in dire straits because we're not producing the workers that we need. And we see that here on Long Island. If it wasn't for immigrants, our population would be lower than it was in 1980.
That's a great transition to my next question. David, there are about 500,000 immigrants who live and work on Long Island. That's about 1 in 5. And you found that 20% of the island's economic input comes from immigrants. So tell me, what would that number look like if there were change at the federal level?
Well, I don't think you see a big change in the number of immigrants on Long Island if there were immigration reform. I think what you would see is finally a resolution to the idea of undocumented immigrants having having not the legal status to work, and you would see a change, I think, in the sense that people would then, you'd see a rising of the bottom. Basically, you'd see immigrants making a little bit more money. You'd see a little bit of a cleaning up of the low-wage labor market, and I think you'd see improvements in tax revenues. You'd see improvements in the local economy, where you have more of a level playing field between businesses that are hiring on the books and off the books and so on. So I think that you'd see some improvements locally. I wouldn't expect to see a big change in the number of immigrants, because immigration reform is largely about getting control of our immigration system. It's not about saying let's have lots of new immigrant categories.
But as far as the economic input, the contributions they make to the island, you feel it would be significantly bigger or marginally? What's your opinion?
I think you'd see some improvement. I think so. We estimate about a 10% increase in the wages people would make, because half of that would come from them not being taken advantage of in the labor force, and half of that would come from them improving their own conditions. Right? That there's an increase in productivity as they invest in learning English, as they feel more committed to be and secure in being here, as they can get a better job match with different employers. So I think you'd see about a 10% increase in the wages of about 18% of the population. Well, actually, I'm sorry, that would be of about the undocumented population. So about 100,000 workers. So that's an increase. That's an improvement. It's not a dramatic change. I don't think anybody would expect to see.
But it is something.
But it's something.
Right. Gotcha. All right. We're going to take a short break, and we'll continue the discussion right after this. Welcome back to Diverse Long Island. I'm here with Luis Valenzuela, Executive Director of the Long Island Immigrant Alliance, and David Disegard-Kallick, a Senior Fellow with the Fiscal Policy Institute, which is a nonpartisan economic policy think tank. So let's pick up on the discussion. Luis, I'll actually start with you. Some critics say reform is just amnesty and a reward for newcomers who haven't played by the rules. What do you say to that?
Well, clearly, they're wrong. Immigrants have been playing by the rules. Study after study suggests that immigrants are tied to the economy in such a way that they don't have the time to get into all kinds of mischief. So stereotypes about criminality and etc., laziness, drunkenness, are not proven. But clearly, this is the time for immigration reform. Immigration reform, the way it's being proposed is that there would be background checks. Immigrants would have to jump through hoops in order to attain, a legal status. And attaining that legal status then puts them on a path towards citizenship. So it's not an overnight process. It's a process that's going to take some time. Some of the proposed legislation has immigrants, legislation that has been proposed in the past on this path to citizenship for more than 13 years. So it's not an amnesty like President Reagan gave.
David, a lot of people question, how can we give citizenship to undocumented immigrants when you have so many Americans who are still looking for jobs? But you recently wrote an article for the New York Times arguing that immigration reform is a win-win not only for immigrants but for non-immigrants and for employers. Explain that.
Well, so I think there are a few different issues. One is this question about undocumented immigrants who are here today, and I think giving them legal status is going to improve the conditions for them, but it also will improve conditions for the workers who work side by side with them. It's not adding more immigrants, it's not adding more people to the labor force. It's saying the people who already are there are going to have legal rights like everybody else, and therefore hold up the possibility of wages for everybody. I think the question about future immigration is a more complicated one. How do we decide what the right numbers are and how do we get control over that system? The first piece, I think, has to be that you talked about playing by the rules. There have to be some rules to begin with, right? And this is, I think, the problem. I'm sure everybody regrets where we've gotten today, where we have a situation where that's broken down, nothing's working. Employers, and it's employers who are the ones who are in violation of the law primarily, right? Employers and employees are out of are out of compliance, and so we have to figure out how do we wipe the slate clean and make sure everybody's really playing by the rules. And then we say, what's the right number of new immigrants to be coming in? That's a question, and I think it should be, it should be higher in times when there's real labor market demand and lower in times when there's lower labor market demand. But there's no reason that can't be something that works for everyone. And I think you see it right here on Long Island, especially. What you see on Long Island is young adults, U.S.-born adults, right, leaving the island and going other places, and that's hopefully great for them. They get opportunities, go to college, do other things. But then there's this kind of gap in the labor force here. And right now that's being filled largely by immigrants. And I think and it's not just immigrants who are, I think people talk a lot about the day laborers and the landscapers and so on, and that's real. But it's also a lot of accountants and a lot of architects and a lot of nurses. Actually, nurses, I think, is the #1 occupation. It's a lot of people doing jobs up and down the economic ladder, and I think they're important to maintaining the population and the economy of Long Island.
Quickly, last question, Luis, goes to you. You have a PhD in social services, and since you've been doing immigration reform work on the island, have you noticed that attitudes have improved for the better, or do you find that this issue is so divisive, just more so than ever?
No, there has been a marked improvement. One of the unfortunate things that happened earlier this century is that politicians got involved in demonizing immigrants, scapegoating immigrants, and making their names known nationally by standing on an anti-immigrant platform and convincing some of the population that the problems that they were experiencing with wages and et cetera were caused by immigrants. I think people have seen that these myths are very divisive, and that the only way for Long Island to move forward is for all of us to move forward together.
Excellent point. We'll have to leave it right there. Luis, David, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be right back after this break.